Welcome to the One Inside, an Internal Family Systems podcast. I'm your host, Tammy Sollenberger. On today's podcast, I chat with Gaby Satarino about culturally responsive practices in Latinx mental health. Hey everyone, I'm so excited to chat with Gaby today. Gaby presented the first Spanish-speaking workshop at the 2021 IFS Annual Conference. She's a level 1 trained psychotherapist who practices in Texas, and her website is GabySatarinoCounseling.com. If you want to connect with me, you can go to my website, TammySollenberger.com, and you can find all the information about the past 106 episodes of the podcast, and you can find out about my new book coming out in January, The One Inside, 30 Days to Your Authentic Self. I was hoping to have a little holiday gift for you, but I think we'll have to wait till the new year. Speaking of the new year, I'm going to roll out 6 weekly episodes where Joan, Ryan, and I talk about the integration of IFS and the Enneagram. These are going to be 30-minute episodes where we banter and just explore with you what we've been exploring with our groups and in our workshops and with our chat together about the integrations of these two models. So we're both really excited to give that to you. So here's what I'm thinking for the new year. I want to encourage you to pick a word. I pick a word every year. I've been doing it for years. So I want to invite you to pick a word maybe that reminds you of that one inside, that true authentic self. And so when you say the word, when you think the word, when you write the word down on Post-it notes and put it all over your house, it'll remind you of that resource that you have with you at all times. Enjoy. So Gaby, tell everybody where you're from, where you are, and what would you see if you looked out your nearest window?
I am connecting from beautiful Dallas, Texas, and I'm in my home office. And this is the quietest place of my house. And my favorite part of this space is this floor to ceiling, large bay windows that face the east. So when the sun comes up, I definitely feel that bright and warm sun, and it opens up to my backyard where I can see these 2 beautiful oak trees. And my background music sounds like this. Yeah, so this is music from a group called Grupo Fantasma, and they're actually from Texas. They're this Austin Grammy Award jamming band that they do a beautiful job of crisscrossing Latin forms like cumbia with R&B and soul and hip hop. And I think this band does such a beautiful job of bringing their Latin roots of rhythm with those in the US, which is something that I deeply resonate with. So I'm a Mexican immigrant, and when I was 4 years old, I moved to the United States, and I grew up speaking Spanish at home and learning English at school. And as a family, we were all kind of learning at the same time, what did it mean to live in the United States as a bilingual, bicultural immigrant? And Tammy, I feel like I bring so much of who I am into the therapy room. And it makes me think that at such a young age, I fell in love with psychology and I knew I was going to be a therapist. And now I have more than 20 years of clinical experience. I'm a level 1 IFS trained. And like most people, I just fell in love with IFS, mostly because of the amazing and transformative changes we see in the lives of our clients. So I began using IFS with the Latinx community, especially since my focus has been on addressing how Latinx culture values impact engagement and treatment outcomes in therapy. So I am just coming off the 2021 IFS conference where I presented in Spanish. I'm so excited to say that. And it was so wonderful how well it was received. This was the first time ever that a workshop was offered in a language other than English, and with 48 countries participating, so many native Spanish speakers were able to participate.
I love that. I love that. And wow, I can't imagine what that felt like for you.
Yeah, that was amazing. So it was wonderful that it was so well received and really just bringing and beginning to have deeper conversations. And I think what I bring to the IFS community are these nuances about how do we bring IFS into the therapy room when working with the Latinx community in the United States, right? By highlighting the importance of having a culturally aligned contextual interview, looking at the ecological frameworks, when we're looking at protective parts, how do we increase or bring into the therapy room spirituality to access the self better? And so important, Latinx, not all, but the majority have are bilingual. And how do we bring in the benefits of language switching, especially for trauma retrieval?
I love it. Okay, let's unpack everything that you just said because that was beautiful. Um, why don't we start by telling everyone what is Latinx?
Yeah, so Latinx has typically been adopted among people who are looking for a more inclusive and gender free alternative to Latino or Latino. In Spanish, words are automatically gendered to signify a man or a woman. And this leaves no options for those who choose to identify as non binary. Yeah, so we're starting to see that the word Latinx is coming with a new generation that's thinking more about gender politics. And the truth is that there's this energy behind it that it wants to connect to have a much larger conversation about culture and creating a shared sense of belonging and being visible as a community.
I love that. I love that. And so you talked about considering the Latinx like frameworks of the culture when working with protective parts. And so tell me how that would be different. Like if I was working with a Latinx client, how would it be different working with their parts?
Yeah, so it would be different specifically when talking about the culture. And I just want to just kind of pause and pull up for a second and say that many of your amazing and beautiful listeners right now may be saying, I don't work with the Latinx community. I am not bilingual. And just really shifting gears to say that the Latinx population in the United States last year in 2020 was 62.1 million. So the US government did a comparison between 2010 and 2020, and they found that slightly more than half, 51% of the total US population grew between 2010 and 2020 came from the Latinx population. So with
Wow.
62 million Latinx living in the United States, it's incredibly important to integrate the cultural principles, especially in treatments. And as our listeners may say, I don't speak Spanish. I love Mexican and Latino food, but I don't see that population. How will this podcast be important to me? How can I take information? What's the benefit? And the benefit is that if you're doing clinical work in the United States, your clients at some point in their life will have some connection, some impact, and some influence in the Latinx community. And so, Tammy, really, the purpose of my work is just not to specifically speak to bilingual therapists, which is my focus, but the purpose of my work is really to bring a larger conversation of increasing our attention, sensitivity, and how do we respond to a contextual and cultural experience of the Latinx community with the goal of being culturally sensitive when we're using IFS.
I love that. I love that so much. What what do you feel like people need to know first? Like whether they work with this population or not, what is it you feel like they need to know?
Yeah, I love that. I'm totally stealing your line because I use that all the time. So if your listeners hear us, we're going to say, I love that. We're echoing each other. But here's the important thing, and this is what I have learned in working with the Latinx population, is that so often, and what's different is that so often Latinx clients do not always bring all their parts into session, but we know they're impacting their system. Most of the time, they don't bring them simply because they are not aware that these parts are here. And since they're not bringing them into the therapy room, it's almost impossible for us as therapists to welcome these parts and to work with them. So it's so important that this is a place where we begin to build a culturally responsive practices in Latinx mental health, and to begin to explore and unpack why are these parts not showing up, and when they do show up, how do we work with them differently given that there's a cultural lens and flavor to them, and how can we grow as a culture to incorporate not just the Latinx parts, but how do we incorporate it to be as a whole? And so let's start by just talking about some examples of possible polarizations that I've experienced myself and that I've also seen in my clients. And these would be in the category of immigration, integrative stress, discrimination, generational beliefs, and the use of language. Let's start first with the category of immigration, and makes me think of this client that I had. Her name was Lucia, and Lucia was this 45-year-old woman who came to the US to provide her children better education, because she knew that this would open up the opportunity for her children to be college educated. And so there was a part of Lucia that felt really grateful to be here and to be able to see her children attend school and get scholarships and eventually lead off to college. But then there was another part of her that felt really guilty for those family members that weren't able to come to the US. And, certainly as therapists, we can pick up on this obvious polarization. However, often clients are not aware of the polarization, and they may just speak from the part of gratitude, for example, which was, the case of Lucia. Lucia came in because she was having some depression, and the part of her that was like, I need to be grateful, would show up in therapy, and she would leave at the door, guilt.
Yeah.
However, guilt would continue to impact the depression.
Yeah.
But she was not able to speak about it because she didn't have that awareness. She didn't have aware of the polarization. This leads me to think of another client. When we think about integrative stress, I think of Claudia. And Claudia was, I can still see her in my mind. Claudia is like this firecracker Mexican woman who was a banker. She was actually an administrator in Mexico. Well, her and her husband divorced, and he moved to the US. And 2 years later, they decided to repair their marriage, and they got married again. So she joined her husband in Texas. But she was unable to continue with her profession, which she loved. So she shows up in therapy, and she's speaking, and there is a part of her that feels stress of not being able to express her identity through her profession in this country. And then there's another part that has a strong desire to be part of the culture, to acculturate. And then in therapy, what would show up for her was the strong desire to be part of an American and what that meant. And she had locked up the part of her that wanted to be a banker, because she says that's in the past. You have no space here.
Yeah, I love it. This is so interesting. So I love this idea that, and a part of me is like, this is so obvious, but it's just dawning on me right now that, like, what parts that not recognizing, or what I'm trying to say, like, not recognizing what parts people leave outside the therapy room, because for all kinds of reasons, but maybe because they feel like they're not allowed, right? They have to push them, or they have to exile those parts before they even come into therapy. So the first one, was it Lucia? Like, so Lucia, she had to exile the part of her that felt guilty, because she should, in quotes, I should feel grateful, and all I'm allowed to feel is grateful, and all I'm allowed to speak for is gratefulness. And so the part of her that felt guilty doesn't even come into the therapy room. And my guess is, what you also mean by like working with parts differently is some cultural things that sometimes that's not brought into therapy room because they think it's not allowed, or that they're like, so you said, this is what you said, this, sorry. I'm like, my mind's going so fast that you said that they're not even aware of those parts. And I'm wondering if some of those like cultural or spiritual or passionate, like those parts have to be pushed away. I'm kind of using my hand to push those away because maybe they feel like they're not allowed, or they're not going to be accepted. And then into sort of fit in air quotes, to America and to the American culture, how many of their parts do they feel like they have to exile?
That's right. And we see that with discrimination. That's one that I think we could, every single person listening, whether you're aware you've been discriminated or not, we have all felt discrimination. And I think, when I think of the experience of my client, this is what I often hear is there's a part of me that feels pain of being mistreated fairly and being treated badly. But there's another part of me that feels powerless and things aren't going to change. It makes me think of, I worked at a trauma level 1 hospital for nearly 15 years as a trauma therapist. And often, sometimes I was sadly, the only bilingual therapist. And I would hear clients, that were undocumented come and speak about this discrimination and how they kind of lived it in their daily lives, but also how they would they would experience discrimination even with hospital staff. And there was this sense of suck it up, keep your head down, and be grateful that you're here and that you have a job. So I have to tell you, I'm not a social worker, but I think I have a social worker part of me because I love social workers. And not just a social worker, but I also have this feisty Latin flair in me that when I would hear that, Tammy, I would be like, who discriminated you? And instead of going to that department and instead of going to that coworker, there's something called Outlook, which lets you know who reports to who, like who's that person's boss. I'd go straight to that. I became first level with VPs and AVPs. It's like, hey, are you aware? And if you think of discrimination, how often we don't have the voice doesn't have a voice, right? It makes me think about this woman where she hadn't, she was a victim of a crime, and as a result, she lost hearing on her left ear, and hearing aids are like $2,000, right? So very difficult. And this woman would show up and she would make a payment plan where she'd pay $100 this week, and in 2 weeks she'd pay $100. Part of it was in cash, part of it in the debit, and there was an employee that was really discriminating her. And so spoke with the VP, he observed it, and not only did they observe and correct the situation, and the client got an apology, but they also forgave the balance, which was amazing. But however, to her, it was just a given that this is something she had to suck up and put up and not bring into the therapy session. And so often I see that discrimination. Same thing with our generational beliefs, right? Our client wants to preserve our generational beliefs. For example, I have to be a warrior at all costs. But then coming to the US, the person wants to adopt the new dominant culture and the social practices and prefers to lose some of the traditional roles. And lastly, when I think about polarization, is the use of language, and language is power, right? So when we think about a part of the client that wants to speak Spanish and maintain the rich Spanish language, but then there's another part that wants to learn English and forget about Spanish, because if the client learns English, they will be included, less discriminated, some level of empowerment. And so often I hear this from second generations that clients that their parents were born in Latin America came to the US, and now they are born in the US. And so often, I can't tell you how many times I have heard this phrase, I have been stripped from my native tongue. And why does that
Mm.
happen? So, there's an actress, her name is Gina Rodriguez, and she speaks about how her parents were discriminated for speaking Spanish. And they wanted to make sure that their children were not discriminated. So what did they do? They didn't speak Spanish, and they encouraged her to only speak English. And so this is a quote from her. She says, but now they're hurting me because I'm not Latina enough to speak Spanish because it's not my first language. But they don't know that I couldn't speak Spanish because my parents were afraid that they would hurt me.
Wow.
And there's this beautiful documentary that NBC conducted called Young Latinos Born in the US, Craving Their Identity. So I'll be sure to pass that along to put it in the notes.
Perfect. So I'm hearing two things I think so interesting is one is when we just accept things about ourselves, like I'm just going to be discriminated against, I'm just going to be treated poorly. This is just what it is. When I accept those things, then I don't realize that there are parts, right? I don't realize that there are parts because it's just sort of I'm just accepting it. I'm just accepting that this is how I'm going to be. So then I don't. I'm guessing there's pretty good reasons why I don't then say this is not okay. This is unfair. This is wrong. And so then I'm not really recognizing those parts because I just sort of have to accept. I just have to accept that, accept and be grateful. Part of me is
Yeah.
like, oh, that feels terrible.
I think
Now I'm mad.
yeah, yes, the social worker needs
Yeah,
coming
right.
out. Yeah, and I think, and here's the important thing is that we as therapists are guilty of assuming that the parts that the clients are bringing into the therapy room are the parts that are present. And so often they're so invisible because they're invisible to the client. So then they're off our radar. And then we continue just to see almost this, we get a sense that there's something else going on, like we feel it in the therapy session, in the therapy room, but it's just this invisible obstacle that neither of us are able to identify or name.
I love it. Okay. And I think that's why when we're thinking of polarizations, then we need to ask, is there another part? Is there a part that feels different than this part? So if I have a part that, right, so these people that you mentioned coming in, right, coming in and feeling guilty about this. Okay, so there's a part that feels guilty. Is there another part? And that's part of why we need to be good part detectors and ask the questions because we know, I mean, can I say all of our parts are I don't know if I can I say that all of our parts are polarized. They probably are, right? Like if I have one part, I'm guessing all of our parts are polarized. I don't know that that's right, but I'm going to make
They're all connected.
right. They're all connected. Okay,
Part of
that
our
feels probably
system.
better.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we need to ask the question, right? So if they're coming in with if they're coming in with a part, but that's a part, right? The part that brings me into therapy is the part that says I don't want to be depressed anymore. Okay, well that's a part. But then we also know that there's a part that actually does, right? So we need to be holding that polarization in our minds and asking those questions.
Yeah, and just to tie it in just very quickly, that's why it's so important to have a culturally aligned contextual interview through not just in our intake, but throughout all of our treatment. Never once have I been asked in therapy, never once have I been asked in therapy, when did you migrate? When did your family migrate?
Mm,
What is the narrative behind that?
mm.
How has that landed for you? What is there? And I think that, again, incorporating language and culture, migration, language, when is language used? All of these things are so rich that that's one of the bigger parts of it. And I'm actually doing a workshop on how to conduct a culturally aligned interview. And so I'll be happy to give some information about that a little later. How about if we look at protective factors? Because that
Perfect.
really fits in nicely with the polarizations
Yeah.
and then the protective factors. So let's talk about cultural protective factors and the intersection between them and protective factors. So I just want to speak just very with broad very broadly to talk about what is a cultural, how do cultural protective factors begin? You know, when there's a scarcity of resources, we all come together to survive, right? Because we know that individually, I may have one thing, but if there's a scarcity, if I unite with other people, then we come together and we're able to share resources. And when we come and share resources, it creates a sense of unity. And unity always creates more resources, because all of a sudden now we have this stage or this platform where this is where we come, this is where we share. These are some of the things that we do. Eventually, within time and a repetition of survival and of shared resources, it becomes a value. And our value within time and with enough practice becomes a belief. This is what we do. This is the right thing. This is how we aid. This is how we speak. This is how we act. And within time, that almost becomes our unspoken truth. And unspoken truths within time become just automatic expectations that get incorporated into the culture. So when we think about cultural protective factors, we really have to bring into connection. And so connection, and let's think about the idea that IFS has been developed with this Eurocentric lens. So here we have culturally protective factors, and we have IFS identifying some managers that fall and intersect with culturally protective factors. So here's the thing. Often when we're using IFS with the Latinx community, we are asking managers to give us some space, to move back to access the exile. But here's what I want to say to that. Don't ask the managers to move back. Don't ask the managers to move back until we fully understand the cultural waters. Because if we ask a manager to step back in cultural waters, it cannot go well. You know, when we fully don't understand how the impact will be for that person's, not just overall cultural, but personal culture, it can actually create more of a complex or heaviness in their emotional system. And so I'll give you an example to illustrate what I mean by this. So Angie is this very successful entrepreneur Latina who comes in for anxiety. She owns several businesses, but her main business is collecting. You know, she, you know, when they call you and they're like, you haven't paid your hospital bill, you know, do you want to set up a payment plan? So she's very successful, college educated, very outgoing, very smart, very bright, very sharp. And she's having this anxiety. So as we're working on it, her anxiety gets better, but every now and then there's like a dip. And she and I are we are looking, exploring, and like we're bringing the 8 C's. Where's the connection? Let's look at the compassion. Let's look at the curiosity. Let's get creative. Let's look at the clarity. And so we are definitely looking at all of this, but we are unable to identify it because it's off her radar. And if it's off her radar, it's off my radar. Yeah. So again, she's getting better, but every now and then there's these significant dips in her anxiety. It's not until we really begin to look at these cultural factors and really begin to ask about her culture and what that means in her family system. And here's what it is for her, for Angie. She would go back home or she would visit her family, and her family would say, you need to put your brother's college tuition on your credit card. This is just what you have to do. And she would do it. But then the brother would go to college for 2 days and drop out. And it was an expectation that she better not ask him to pay back. And the next time there was a need for that, to sacrifice for the betterment of the family, then there was an expectation that that was something that was part of the culture that was highly valued. And if she did not fit into that, then there was a sense of otherness or exclusion, which she did not want. And of course, in her mind, it wasn't, that was the source of anxiety. That was a source of anxiety that continued to have that part show up. However, it was so linked to her cultural protective factor that maybe a therapist could say, you need to set stronger boundaries, right?
Yeah.
Without realizing that that would actually make things in her system worse than better.
Yeah. Right.
Because we're not taking into account the cultural atmosphere, not just culturally as a Latina in her case, but also the family culture that in her family that's come up.
Right. Yeah, that makes so much sense. Yeah. So how do you suggest we work with that? Is it just having that knowledge or asking those questions about your family? About what would that be like if you yeah. So how would you suggest we work with that?
Oh, I love that you asked that because that's like the nerd in you, and that's like the nerd in me that it's like, okay, that sounds great, but tell me how to do it. And I enrolled in this cohort with other Latinx mental providers, and for 6 months I did a deep dive with them and said, how do we do this? How do we really get to the point where we're able to, we know it, but knowing it is not the same as really getting it,
Yeah.
and so these are the 2 points that I would just love to offer up. And the first one is, it sums up with attunement and self-awareness. Um, let's start with what's this attunement and self-awareness and fresh eyes. What do I mean by that? I've always have thought that when I treat a depressed client, I've only have treated one depressed client, right? And so often in therapy, we get so busy. We all across the US, we are therapists, especially since the pandemic, we are slammed. Like, is it okay that I'm this honest and say we are slammed? And often we just rely on our intuition, on our instincts, and what has worked in the past for this client or for other clients, we just rely to continue to guide our clients in this direction. And I think that that is a big mistake that we do, because when we've worked, and now I say, when I worked with one part, I've only worked with one part, even if it's the same client. And I know this sounds so common sense, but we often fall and we fail because we stay in our one-way lane of assumptions. So having this awareness of, am I having fresh eyes? Even though it's a client that I've seen for a year or a year and a half, am I having fresh eyes with this part that, like I said, when you've worked with one client's part, you've only worked with one client's part. And, I have a sticky here that says, and I have it on my computer that says, how do I feel towards my client right now?
I love that because what's coming up for me is curious, right? If I'm curious, then I can be curious about their part. I can be curious about their family culture. I can be curious about their larger culture. And when I'm in a part who's tired and overworked, then I'm just going to pull out my, oh, this is how I handle a depressed client. Oh, this is how I handle it. It's just fine because I'm really overworked and overtired. Right. And those are my parts. And that's exactly what you just said. Like with your post-it note is reminding you to see if you can get your parts to step back so you can be in more self-energy with your client.
That's right. And so when we're able to step back, then we're able to hear and listen this cultural protective factors, and we just truly invite them to come in. And then there's 2 other points I'd love to offer up. The second one is, we have to be aware of kind of the subtle but very present energy that happens in the therapy room. And it has a lot to do with power, right? And very often in the Latin community, there's a difference, right? They put us as doctors, they put us as high, as an authority figure. And with that comes this desire to want to please the therapist, this desire to, there's so often, our clients' parts are so sophisticated that this part wants to please us, that it knows what to say. I have a client who, she knows IFS so much that there's a part that, like, knows what to say just so I could leave her alone and not get exile. Right.
That's pretty smart.
Yeah. And a lot has, and it's really rooted in around this culture energy of like, you're the therapist, you're the authority, you're the doctor, you know what to do. I must just please. So that's another point. And then the third point that I would love just to offer up is that as a Latinx therapist, I've resolved some of my issues with my managers and with my exiles and with my parts. And I may have a good intention, but unconsciously, there might be a part that's guiding my client's parts, totally unaware. It's not my inclination. But all of a sudden, I get to the point I say, I feel like I need to go there. I feel like we might need to spend a little bit more time with this part or bypass it, or asking open-ended questions, but with leading tones. And as you know, there's a big difference between intention and impact. And I think that's the biggest thing, is to really say, as a therapist, how self-aware am I? And where as I work on resolving my own personal wounds, scars are left. And while we know scars don't often get re-injured, sometimes they do. And if they don't get re-injured, sometimes they get irritated if they continue to be rubbed by something that continues to be triggering for them. So that would definitely be a third point to offer up. The role of spirituality in the Latinx community could be used as an additional option to access the self energy to unburden exiles. It's so wonderful, right? And here in the US, when we talk about religion and spirituality, it's important to mention that there's a great difference, perhaps on perceptions and values coming from grandparents or great grandparents. And it really depends on how close or how far the client is from the migration to this country. So just want to offer up, just to listen cautiously. This has just been my clinical experience with IFS. So here are some things. Some clients that are Christian believe and see the self as the Holy Trinity, right? Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And not all Catholics are evangelical or Christian, but for those who identify themselves as Christian or Catholics, there's ways that we can incorporate that spirituality into IFS. And it has been, I can't tell you, it's been a game changer. That's all I can tell you. Once I've started to incorporate spirituality and prayer, it has been such a big game changer. I have seen us get to the exile a lot faster than my previous experience. And why? It's because these are, religious and spiritual beliefs are anchored and they're deeply rooted in the client's identity. And we can incorporate them as a way to increase or accelerate access to the self. So here's some of the ways that we can do it. We could do it by really asking our client, bringing prayer into the IFS model. For example, I have a client, she loves to pray before we start IFS because she really says it's God that's leading me to the part that I need to talk about today, which is automatically starting to access the self the second we connect in our session, right? The second it starts. Also praying with your clients, if that feels right to you and feels right to the client, this can definitely create a closer alliance between the client and the therapist. But I think that one of the most effective ways to build the self to part relationship is through prayer. And how is this done? It's done by the clients praying for their parts. There's so many times that we're in there and the client's like, I don't know, I can't see my part anymore. It's hidden, it's invisible, it got dark. And in those moments, we kind of step back and I ask the client, pray for this part. And Tammy, it is absolutely incredible how that part shows up automatically. It's just absolutely amazing and beautiful to see because, again, it's creating this connection between the self and the part. Also, we talk in IFS, we talk about checking in with our parts in between sessions. We could also do it as a way to pray for our parts, or ask for intercessions from saints or friends or deceased relatives. This is a common religious practice to have somebody pray for you or pray for your parts as intercessions. And then, the last one is specifically with Catholics, when I help them unburden and we offer some positive qualities to take now or they might need in the future, we offer and invite the gifts and virtues of the Holy Spirit, which is a language that's so aligned with their identity and so deeply anchored in who they are. And it's just been such a beautiful way that it's been able to integrate God and religion and cultural rituals. Now, I do have to tell you that there's been a couple of challenges, when we use prayer. Some clients have a self-like Christian part, right? And so it looks like it is Christian, or it looks like the self, but it's not. Also, some polarizations. This is my cross to bear, but I no longer want to carry it. So some scripture ideas around that. And then the last one is some clients think that it's bad to speak to your parts because they're spirits. I had an IFS session with a pastor, and she was like a pastor for a long time. And there was a part of her that showed up as deception. And she's like, I don't want to do this anymore. This is an evil spirit. And my church leader told me not to interact with this part again. So important to understand the client system and, again, their culture. And then the last one is the benefit of code switching. So here's what we know. We know that many, not all, but many Latinx clients are bilingual. And sometimes wherever the trauma occurred, in the language that the trauma occurred is the language where it was stored. So I have a client Nancy, she comes in, she's, in her 30s, professional Latinx, and she's working with her 3-year-old. And she can't really connect with her 3-year-old. And I remember in session telling her, Nancy, I remember that when you were 3, you mostly spoke Spanish. Just talk to her in Spanish. Oh my gosh, automatically, she was like, oh, she's talking back to me. She didn't understand me before. And so it's so important to have an idea of language and how is this exile stored? What is the language around it? And just because your client is speaking English and perfect English doesn't mean that there might be trauma that was stored in a different language.
That's fascinating. That is fascinating. I love that. And that speaks to that attunement, right? It speaks to how attuned you are and how you're listening and you're really attuned to the client system with spirituality and with code switching, because they don't have necessarily, even if you have the same faith, it's not the same, right? There's something different. Something's going to be a little bit different. And the more attuned we can be and ask the questions and be curious and not make assumptions about their spirituality or what prayer means to them, or, just because it's sort of like inviting Jesus in, that sometimes is spiritual bypassing and sort of gross, but sometimes it's beautiful and amazing. And so I love that.
Love it. Love it.
You have a culturally aligned contextual interview workshop coming up. So tell me a little bit about what that is. Like, what is that type of interview? And tell me about the workshop you have.
Yeah, so I really have spent some time trying to find a way that was culturally sensitive and responsive. Often we just find culturally sensitive or we find responsive. So bringing these two together. And I actually have pulled from working with 2 of the psychologists that actually developed them, is pulling, actually I have 4, but I pulled the best from this one and the best from this one and the best from this one and the best from this one. I almost felt like I was like, if you're a woman, you'll understand, when you go shopping, you just don't try on one thing. Like, you get as many things as you can, because you're like, not everything's going to look cute. And because it looks cute on the hanger, might not look cute on me. And I don't want to come back and keep doing this, right? I want to be in there and see what fits and what doesn't. So I have pulled from all these different frameworks of interviews and added the things that I've mentioned to you today about language, about polarization, about how to work with our parts without having them to ask to step back and violating maybe some of the cultural protective factors that could break an alliance with a client and with their system, and really starting to use it with a compassionate lens and putting, importantly, the client as the expert of their life and incorporating our therapeutic interactions. So all to say, I told you I can spend the whole the whole podcast speaking about this, but for anyone who's interested, I'm more than happy to share this. And that's what I'm doing. I'm doing a workshop that really goes through all of these roots of or different factors that I've come together to offer up this culturally aligned contextual interview with IFS when working with the Latinx community.
I love it. I love it. And where can people find out about the workshop?
Yeah, they can definitely go to my website, GabySatarinoCounseling.com.
Perfect. And then you're also running some consultation groups. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I actually have some consultation groups that are really focused on bringing in culture. And at first, I have to tell you, I thought it would just draw in more bilingual therapists, but it really hasn't. It's been actually beautiful to hear other counselors, other IFS counselors that come from another ethnic or other backgrounds that are so interested in wanting to learn more about the cultural piece. They really want to have a deeper understanding because it's not often spoken about or as easily accessed, or they might not have other professionals or other therapists or other colleagues that they can speak about. And it's so important to them because that's who they serve, right?
Yeah.
If you're Indian, you have a lot of clients that are looking for you that identify themselves with you and so on.
What I'm taking from what you're saying is the principles and what you're teaching us today really could be applied to any culture, like working with any culture.
That's right. That's right. And it's so, I almost think that it's so essential. Culture is who we are.
Yeah. You said that earlier about it's right. If we anchor it into, I think with the spirituality, if we anchor it into what we've learned in our spirituality and our family, like that's who we are. So we're anchoring it into who we are. Can I ask you my last question?
Sure.
Okay. So if you weren't doing all that you do and you had to do something different in your life, what would you do?
Oh, this one's an easy one. Um, so I remember when I was a junior in high school, I sat with my mom and I said, "Mom, I'm either gonna go become a therapist, or I'm gonna go to college, or I'm gonna go to culinary school." She said, "Go to college." But that's what I would do. I would definitely. I have this fantasy that I'm gonna call myself the gourmet therapist because I think that they're both it's almost like having two children. You have to have both of them in your life. And I love cooking, that I definitely would incorporate. Even though I'd be a gourmet chef, I would call myself a gourmet therapist.
I love it. Well, isn't cooking part of therapy, right? Like, or like not, but it's my my office is next to this little cafe, and the woman that runs it is Kim, and I love her, and I often feel like she's giving me therapy by making this sort of homemade soup or making me a healthy smoothie or giving me the chocolate chip cookie. Like it feels like some good therapy when someone cooks for you.
That's right. It's all about love. Over Thanksgiving, my children found a quirk about me. Like I had kept it secret all this time from them. And then they heard me. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's no turning back. I talked to my food. I'm like, come on, guys, you can do it. And they were like, Mom, are you talking to the food? I was like, yes, because I'm a relational person.
I'm more impressed that they haven't heard you do that. Like kids are so, attuned to us. So I think it's funny that they haven't heard you.
Yes, I think because I was like, I kept it quiet until that one day that I was really wanting everything just to come on, guys, let's all work together. Spices.
I
But
love
yeah,
it.
I definitely would be a gourmet therapist and
That's great.
definitely serving up some authentic Mexican dishes.
That's great. Well, Gabby, this was great. I'm super excited to chat with you, and this was really fun. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. Such deep gratitude towards your listeners for taking the time and just sharing this podcast with us. So a special thanks to them and to you.
Thanks. Thanks for hanging out today. If you liked this episode, make sure you subscribe. And if you really like this episode, share it with a friend and leave a review. You can follow me on Instagram at IFS Tammy and join our community on Facebook at the One Inside Podcast. Talk to you next time.